All right, welcome back. I hope you had a chance to review the navigating the problem space IQ card and had a chance to review the second section of the first section of the presentation. And now we're going to kind of move on with section two. And so now what I want to do is I want to take a little bit of time to go back to AIS. And it might feel like that's kind of in the distant memory now, but I really want to connect some of the things that you learned in AIS with the gaming and simulation course. And usually what I do at this point, I invite one of your instructors from AIS to come and join us, but we couldn't do it in this particular case. But I wanted to review with you briefly the ADDIE model. And it's really important when we're trying to think about to have a plan where we're developing instructional design, right? It's not good enough to simply just walk into a classroom and just expect to talk and teach if you don't have a clear understanding and have a clear understanding about the process and the kind of learning objectives and the kind of outcomes that you're looking for. So the ADDIE model does a really nice job of giving us a way to approach that. And it of course starts off with learner analysis where we understand who our learners are. Developing learning content for college students is very different from developing fourth graders. They have completely different needs. They have completely different expectations. And so as we're thinking about designing for converting our exhibits into board games, we need to think real carefully about who our learners are. Now, if you're trying to, for example, design a board game in based off of your exhibit, and you think that the exhibit was designed for graders, and the graders, you don't have to do much. It's because the graders would care about the two priority within the exhibit. You want to exhibit for professional development, adults who are in professional development to think differently. They can handle more complex ideas. And we constantly think about who these people are and what they're going to do. And then next, we're going to think about, we're going to think about the design process, and we're going to think about the development process, the implementation process. And throughout all of that, we're going to be circling all of that around evaluation. We're going to be looking at the outcomes that the students achieve. What are their performative outcomes? What can they, are they, is their knowledge being successfully achieved, and is it being demonstrated when you do their formal assessment? And that gives you, and if you find the answer is yes, then you've done a pretty good design. But if you find the answer is no, then what we have to do is we need to go back and reevaluate again and try to figure out, okay, where do we go off the rails? Where did the students get confused? Where weren't the instructions clear? And this design can be done kind of at a meta perspective when we're thinking about, say, where our games might exist in an entire class or entire course that somebody might take. But they can also you can also then scale that down and think again, how can our games go through these kinds of designs? And what I really like about the ADDIE model is it's iterative. That means it gives us an opportunity to keep trying by looking at this different opportunities for revision in the development process, revision in the learner analysis, revision in the design, revision in the implementation. That's one of the reasons why you do your final project 3 times. It gives you an opportunity to iterate. And every time you iterate and every time you test your game and your model, what happens is you start refining, refining, refining. You start getting rid of things that you might have thought was a great idea, they thought might be really cool. But when you in the actual doing, in the actual implementation stage, you realize, oh no, this isn't going to work at all. It's not going to work with the audience or with my fourth grade audience because they can't sit still long enough to do this, or they might not work with my adult professional audience because I'm not giving them enough information. It's too basic. And so by reevaluating again and again and again, we're refine, 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 refine. And a couple things that we want to specifically want to make sure that we're thinking about is as we're doing the refining and we're doing that review process, are we looking at formative or assessment or summative assessments? And formative assessment are the kind of assessments that allow us to figure out they're knowledge checks. You can think of them as quizzes that you would put out at different points where a student would say, oh, wait, I know what this is about. And then you have the opportunity to get their feedback and you say, oh, wait, now this is an opportunity for me to adjust my instruction. That's different from summative assessments, which take place at the end of of an experience. So a formative assessment could be something like, as you're in week 2 of a class, you offer a quick quiz, a quick knowledge check, the class to see how they're doing. But the summative assessment might be understanding, say, how to do a full spelling test of an entire class. We can do both formative and summative assessments in games. And formative assessments, we need to start thinking about these as win states and lose states. We need to make that conversion. So assessments become win and lose states. And we also need to understand that that this kind of information can be checked and double checked and reevaluated as it goes on. And we're going to talk more about this. One thing that's also really important when we're looking at the ADDIE model is understand the importance of pre-knowledge. What does a person need to know? In a case like this might be about writing, if we're thinking about in terms of games, this could be writing out instructions or directions that the person needs to have in order to be able to play the game. If you're trying to design a game for very young children, say like in kindergarten age, they don't have the ability to read complex directions if they can read anything or most of anything at all. So it might be important to have your instructions for a game done maybe more in pictograms or with diagrams rather than having written out in complex instructions that might be appropriate for a college or an adult learner. Target audience. This is a critical thing. We have to know, again, who we're doing this for. And we're going to talk about this later as we start building out personas and model players. But for right now, within the ADDIE model, it does a nice job of reminding us to our learner analysis. And we're going to get more into that learner analysis when we start building out personas later in the course. And also the role of post-game activity. What is the follow-up as a result of this? So a lot of times people say, well, oh, they played the game, they must have learned something. Well, let's think about this in terms of what did they actually learn? And then we can have an opportunity to deconstruct that learning in a post-game activity. We have an opportunity to have a discussion. This is really critical when you're trying to implement this into a classroom. It's not enough just to hand them the game and say, here you go, off you go. It's important to have follow-up activities to do with them as well. And to kind of break some of this down, what I've done is I've kind of developed this very complicated looking diagram, but we're going to break this diagram down to different parts here so we start to see how these different things work together. So again, here's our ADDIE model, and we're familiar with the different stages of analyze, design, develop, implement, and evaluate. And these are the kinds of steps that we're not only going to be doing for our lesson design, but we can also start to see how this works in game design. So we're going to always think about from the design, what are our key learning objectives? What does a student need to learn? And we're going to get, in our case, these learning objectives are going to be start to be achieved or start to be derived from looking at our example. And and then we start to look at what are some of the learning mechanics. And learning mechanics is a word some people have taken some different kinds of things that people have taken have had some controversy because what exactly is this a comprehensive list? No, it's not. But what it is, it gets us to start thinking creative and how it works. And so different activities that we ask people to do when they learn things, we ask people to list things. We ask them to use things. We ask them to classify or appraise. And then we start saying, okay, are we going to use these different activities in our learning objectives to design more effectively? And the same kind of thing is that when we start looking at instructional strategies, right? There are different kinds of instructional strategies that you learned about in AIS. Some of them are task-centered, some of them might be intrinsic, some of them are constructivist. Can they build their own learning? And there's even other designs. And when we start looking at the instructional strategies, we start looking at problem solving, skill building, narrative comprehension, mastery attempts, things to build, or create, or devise strategies. And these are different methodologies to allow students to achieve their learning objectives. And then finally, down here, we have assessment. And then assessment is done again in win and lose states. And assessment mechanics are going to be done in win and lose states, point totals, system logs files, and leaderboards. These are ways for us to derive different methodologies for us to derive how somebody actually did. So think about this. As I said, this diagram is really bringing together what we know about ADDIE and instructional design, and it's really trying to amalgamate or combine it with this assessment process and these different activities we would do in a game. So down here, this is really what we want to think about in the mechanics and design, aesthetics and dynamics that to support this. And when we start to implement a game design that incorporates these different aspects all together, what we start to see is we have a really comprehensive model for combining a game that's a learning activity that we want to be just a learning activity and not just fun to play. There are lots of games that are fun to play, but we want to actually teach with our games. And using a model like this and identifying these different parts for yourselves and your teammates allow you to say, okay, it provides you a very clear map with how to move forward in your design process. So as you go through your design process, make sure to clearly identify your learning objectives. What are you going to actually have them do? What do they need to be able to accomplish as a result of it? And then what are the instructional strategies? What are some of the strategies that they need to do in order to have their game work effectively? And you can start to look at this. You can start to combine, start seeing how constructivist learning, intrinsic experiential design works with skill building, right? Or there was something they have to build or create or design, devise a strategy. And then down here, thinking about assessment strategies. How do you know if the person is going to has achieved learning objectives or not? And that is if they've achieved a win state in the game, if they have high point totals, maybe use system logs or maybe leaderboards. So when we think about putting all those things together, this gives you kind of a nice format for thinking about how to use what you already know about the ADDIE model to successfully build out your games and think about how to build more successful learning games. And we're going to talk about some of this more in class, but I wanted to introduce this model to you, and hopefully this has been helpful. All right, so right now we're going to pause, and we're going to come back and talk about section 3.